The sound of the wind in the Wadi Hadramaut is a language all its own, a low, steady hum that has carried the dust of 2,000 years across the floor of the valley. It is a dry, patient sound, whispering through the gaps in the limestone cliffs and over the vast, empty plains of southern Yemen. If you were to stand there in the silence, you might feel as though the earth itself is breathing, exhaling the heat of a long-forgotten day. And then, as you round a bend in the ancient caravan path, the horizon shifts. Emerging from the haze is something that seems entirely impossible. A cluster of slender, white-capped towers rising hundreds of feet into the air, huddled together like a group of giants whispering secrets in the middle of a wasteland. This is Shibam, a city of mud and gravity that has stood as a sentinel in the desert since the time of the Romans, yet it defies every logic we hold about how ancient civilizations were supposed to live. As the light begins to soften, the city undergoes a transformation. The harsh glare of the midday sun gives way to a deep, honeyed amber that clings to the vertical walls. These are not the cold, reflective surfaces of modern steel and glass. They are living skins of sun-dried earth and straw. Each building is a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering, rising 5, 6, or even 7 stories high, their facades coated in a pale lime wash that glows with an ethereal radiance in the golden hour. The shadows stretch long and thin across the desert floor, reaching out like fingers toward the distant mountains, while the upper windows of the skyscrapers catch the final glimmers of the day. There is a profound stillness here, a sense that time has folded in on itself, leaving this vertical island floating in a sea of sand. We are told that the people who built this were nomads and traders, dwellers of tents and open spaces, and yet they chose to stack their lives toward the heavens in a way that wouldn't be seen again until the birth of modern Chicago or New York. The mystery of Shibam lies not just in its beauty, but in its defiance of the timeline we have been taught. Archaeologists often look for the slow progression of architectural skill, yet here, the vertical city seems to have been born from a sudden, unexplained necessity or a lost tradition that stretches back into the deep time of the pre-Islamic world. Why, in a landscape with infinite horizontal space, would a culture choose to compress itself into such a dense, vertical labyrinth? The traditional explanations speak of defense against raiding tribes or protection from the rare but devastating flash floods that roar through the wadi. But as you gaze up at the sheer scale of these mud-brick monuments, those answers feel incomplete. There is a rhythmic quality to the architecture, a deliberate elegance that suggests something more than mere survival. It feels like a statement, a testament to a sophisticated mastery of materials that we are only beginning to understand through the lens of modern stratigraphy, which is simply the study of the layers of earth and history piled one on top of the other. It is a wonderful thing to lose oneself in the echoes of the past as the world outside grows quiet. If you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these ancient mysteries, you are exactly where you belong. Here at the Slumber Archives, we bring you new history narrations every single day, crafted to help you drift into a peaceful sleep while exploring the wonders of our world. If you find these stories helpful, please consider subscribing so you never miss a journey, and perhaps leave a like to help other tired souls find their way to us. For now, let us return to the shadows of the Wadi Hadramaut, where the sand meets the sky. The air in Shibam carries the faint, sweet scent of dry earth and old wood. The doors to these towers are often carved from heavy jujube wood, weathered by centuries of wind into a silver-grey patina. To touch the walls is to touch the very ground beneath your feet, transformed by human hands into a soaring sanctuary. The builders used a technique that has remained virtually unchanged for 2 millennia, mixing the silty soil of the valley floor with straw and water, treading it into a thick paste, and letting the fierce Arabian sun bake it into bricks of incredible strength. This is a city that must be constantly maintained, a living organism that requires the touch of its inhabitants to survive. Every few years, a new layer of lime plaster is applied to the roofs and upper walls to deflect the heat and shed the rain, giving the city its iconic snow-capped appearance. It is a cycle of renewal that has persisted through the rise and fall of empires, through the shifting of trade routes and the drying of ancient wells. When we speak of deep time, we are speaking of the vast stretches of history that lie just beyond our reach, hidden beneath the shifting dunes. The foundations of Shibam are believed to date back at least 2,000 years to the era of the Hadramaut kingdom, a time when the incense trade made this region one of the wealthiest on earth. Frankincense and myrrh, more valuable than gold, flowed through these valleys on the backs of enormous camel caravans destined for the temples of Rome and the palaces of Persia. The wealth of the incense route funded the creation of these desert cathedrals, yet the true origin of their vertical design remains a point of quiet debate. Some whisper of even older influences, of connections to lost civilizations that understood the mathematics of the stars and the hidden properties of the earth. The city is a grid of narrow alleys, barely wide enough for two people to pass, where the sky is reduced to a thin ribbon of blue far above. This density creates a natural cooling system. The tall buildings cast deep shadows that keep the streets in a perpetual, breezy dimness even in the height of summer. It is an ancient form of climate control, a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics achieved without a single wire or machine. As you walk through these corridors, the sounds of the desert fade away, replaced by the muffled echoes of footsteps on packed earth and the distant call of a bird circling the rooftops. The towers seem to lean in toward one another, creating a sense of intimacy and protection that is almost maternal. There is a strange paradox in the fact that these buildings, made of the most fragile materials, have outlasted the stone monuments of many other cultures. It is their very flexibility, their need for constant human care, that has preserved them. In the world of archaeology, we often look for the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change roughly 12,800 years ago, as a marker for the upheaval of human society. While Shibam is much younger, it represents a similar struggle to adapt to an unforgiving environment. It is a triumph of the human spirit over the void of the desert, a vertical forest of mud, standing in defiance of the heat and the wind. As the last of the light fades and the first stars begin to pierce the velvet canopy of the Arabian night, the Manhattan of the desert becomes a silhouette of jagged peaks against the cosmos. The mystery of why it was built and how it has endured so long in such a fragile state remains etched into every brick and every grain of sand. We may never fully explain the impulse that drove a nomadic people to build so high and so close together, but perhaps we aren't meant to. Perhaps some things are meant to be experienced rather than solved, to be felt in the cool evening air and the rhythmic sigh of the wind. The towers of Shibam stand as a reminder that even in the most desolate places, humanity has always reached for the heights, building monuments of earth that touch the stars, waiting patiently for the world to remember their names. To understand the vertical defiance of these desert towers, one must first look downward, into the very bones of the earth that support them. Long before the first brick was molded by human hands, the landscape of the Wadi Hadramaut was being sculpted by forces that operate on a scale of time we can scarcely comprehend. Imagine, if you will, a vast and silent limestone plateau, a high, flat wilderness known as the Geology, stretching out under an unforgiving sun for hundreds of miles. This is a world of ancient sedimentary rock laid down layer by layer over millions of years, when this entire region lay beneath a shallow, prehistoric sea. The weight of those eons is pressed into every stone, a silent record of a time when the Arabian Peninsula was not a desert, but a cradle of water and life. As the tectonic plates shifted and the climate began its slow, agonizing transformation into the arid expanse we see today, the water did not simply vanish. It retreated, carving deep, jagged wounds into the limestone as it went. These are the canyons of the Hadramaut, immense sheer-sided ravines that drop away from the plateau as if the earth itself had been split by a giant's blade. At the bottom of these canyons, hundreds of feet below the scorching winds of the Jol, lies a different world entirely. The Wadi is a narrow ribbon of potential, a sanctuary of silt and shadow where the geography itself dictates the terms of survival. Here, the walls are so high and the floor so narrow that the passage of time seems to slow, the verticality of the landscape exerting a constant, silent pressure on everything that dwells within it. In this deep trench, water is not a constant companion, but a rare and terrifying visitor. For most of the year, the riverbeds are bone dry, ribbons of dust and smooth pebbles that wind between the cliffs. But then, without warning, the seasonal rains fall upon the distant mountains, and the canyons transform. A wall of water, known as a sail, rushes down the wadi, with a roar that can be heard miles away, a flash flood of immense power that carries with it the lifeblood of the desert. This water brings the silt, a fine and nutrient-rich sediment washed down from the heights which settles upon the valley floor as the floods recede. It is this specific geological cycle, the violent arrival of water and the quiet deposition of earth, that provided the ancient builders with their primary resource. The clay of the Hadramaut is unlike the sand of the surrounding dunes. It is a unique composition of weathered limestone, volcanic ash, and organic silt, a material that, when mixed with water and straw, creates a substance of surprising resilience. The locals call it zabur. When this mud is formed into bricks and dried in the intense heat of the canyon sun, it becomes as hard as the very stone it was carved from. Yet it remains a living material, porous enough to breathe in the heat of the day, yet dense enough to insulate against the biting chill of the desert night. There is a deep, poetic irony in the fact that these skyscrapers, which reach so ambitiously toward the heavens, are made entirely of the floor of the ravine. They are quite literally the valley reaching upward to reclaim the height it lost to erosion millions of years ago. The scarcity of this fertile ground, however, created a profound architectural dilemma. In the Wadi Hadramaut, the flat land at the bottom of the canyon is the only place where anything can grow. Every square inch of the valley floor is a precious commodity, a life-giving resource that must be used for agriculture to sustain the population. To build outward would be to destroy the very fields that keep the community alive. And so, the landscape forced a radical solution upon the inhabitants. Because they could not expand horizontally across the precious silt, they were compelled to build vertically. The compact footprint of cities like Shibam was not a choice made for aesthetic reasons, but a necessity born of geological limits. The people were squeezed between the towering limestone walls of the canyon and the need to preserve their narrow strips of green. And in that pressure, the concept of the skyscraper was born, thousands of years before the invention of steel or concrete. As the centuries passed, the builders learned to work in harmony with the canyon's unique environment. They understood the way the wind funnels through the ravines, creating natural cooling currents that they could capture with strategically placed windows. They observed the way the shadows of the cliffs move across the valley floor, timing their construction to ensure that the lower levels of their homes remained in the shade during the hottest hours of the afternoon. There is a profound sense of deep time in these settlements, a feeling that the architecture is merely a continuation of the geology. The ochre and cream hues of the mud brick walls mirror the stratigraphy of the canyon cliffs, making the cities appear almost as if they have grown out of the earth like natural rock formations. But even with this abundance of building material, the question of water remained the central mystery of their existence. How did a civilization manage to thrive in a place where the primary source of water is a destructive flood that occurs only a few times a year? The answer lies in an ancient and sophisticated understanding of hydrology that seems almost impossible for a nomadic people of the deep past. They constructed elaborate systems of dams, sluices, and canals to divert the raging floodwaters into their fields and cisterns, a feat of engineering that required a precise knowledge of the valley's gradient and the behavior of fluid dynamics. This was not merely survival. It was a mastery of a hostile environment, a way of turning the desert's most violent moods into a source of sustained prosperity. Yet as we look at the sheer scale of these canyons and the precariousness of life within them, one cannot help but wonder if there is more to the story than simple necessity. The limestone plateau above is a place of absolute desolation, a limestone graveyard where the wind howls through empty arches and the sun bleaches the land to a blinding white. Why did they stay? Why did they choose to wedge their lives into these narrow cracks in the earth, building higher and higher until their homes rivaled the cliffs themselves? Perhaps the Wadi was more than just a refuge. Perhaps it was a sacred space, a hidden world protected by the vastness of the Jol, where a unique culture could flourish in isolation, away from the prying eyes of the empires that rose and fell in the lands beyond the desert. The deeper one looks into the geology of the Hadramaut, the more the line between the natural and the man-made begins to blur. The towers are made of the canyon, and the canyon is shaped by the same forces that the people sought to harness. It is a closed loop of existence, a cycle of earth, water, and sun that has remained virtually unchanged for 2 millennia. We are left to contemplate the endurance of this relationship, the way a specific mixture of clay and a specific pattern of rainfall could give rise to one of the most anomalous urban experiments in human history. The skyscrapers of Yemen are not just buildings. They are a dialogue between humanity and the deep, silent history of the earth itself, a conversation that continues to echo through the canyons, carried on the scent of dry earth and the cooling evening breeze. Long before the first mud brick was laid in the valley of Wadi Hadramaut, the air itself held the secret to this land's eventual ascent. It was a fragrance, a heavy, cloying sweetness that drifted from the gnarled bark of the Boswellia sacra trees. To the ancient world, this was more than just a scent. It was the breath of the gods, a commodity more precious than gold, and the very foundation upon which these vertical wonders would eventually rise. As we look back through the haze of 2,000 years, we see that Yemen did not exist in isolation, but rather served as the vital, beating heart of the ancient world's most lucrative arteries. It was the pivot point of the incense trade route and a crucial southern anchor for the Silk Road. Imagine, if you will, the slow, rhythmic swaying of camel caravans, thousands of beasts laden with frankincense and myrrh, trekking across the unforgiving sands toward the flickering hearths of Rome, the temples of Egypt, and the palaces of Persia. This was a landscape defined by movement, yet it was this very mobility that necessitated the creation of something permanent, something towering, and something profoundly secure. The wealth generated by these aromatic resins was staggering, an influx of capital that allowed a tribal society to bypass the traditional stages of urban development. While other civilizations were building outwards, spreading their influence across flat plains, the people of ancient Yemen were forced by geography and tribal friction to build upwards. They possessed the means to dream on a vertical scale, funded by the smoke of altars burning thousands of miles away. It is a strange thought to consider that the height of these skyscrapers was paid for by the desire of distant emperors to scent their halls and appease their deities. Archaeological evidence, though often buried beneath layers of shifting silt and the debris of later centuries, suggests that the roots of this verticality stretch back much further than the Islamic era. Using radiocarbon dating, a method where scientists measure the decay of carbon atoms to determine the age of organic materials, researchers have found traces of monumental stone foundations and sophisticated irrigation systems dating back to the first millennium before the Common Era. These findings hint at a pre-Islamic architectural ambition that was already comfortable with scale and height. Stratigraphy, the study of soil layers that acts as a physical timeline of human occupation, reveals a continuous cycle of building and rebuilding, a persistent architectural memory that refused to be extinguished by the passage of time or the changing of faiths. In these lower strata, we find the remnants of a world that understood the precarious nature of prosperity. The incense trade brought immense riches, but it also brought envy and the constant threat of raiding parties from the deep desert, and so the architecture began to reflect a unique blending of mercantile success and tribal necessity. The buildings had to be more than just homes, they had to be fortresses. By elevating the living quarters high above the ground, the inhabitants created a vertical hierarchy of safety. The ground floors were reserved for livestock and storage, thick-walled and windowless, acting as a massive, solid plinth that could withstand a siege. Above this, the family lived in a series of ascending chambers, each level offering more light, more air, and more distance from the dangers of the street. As the years passed, this defensive posture evolved into a sophisticated aesthetic. The prosperity of the trade routes allowed for the refinement of the mud brick technique, turning a humble material into a medium for high art. We see the emergence of intricate fretwork, white limewash accents that gleam like lace against the ochre clay, and windows positioned to catch the slightest movement of the cooling evening breeze. There is a sense of patient evolution here, a slow sharpening of skills over dozens of generations. The builders were not merely reacting to their environment, they were mastering it, using the very earth beneath their feet to reach for the heavens. One cannot help but wonder about the early architects whose names have been swallowed by the desert. Did they look at the natural rock pillars of the canyon walls and see a blueprint for their own survival? Or was the verticality a spiritual impulse, a desire to rise above the heat and the dust of the terrestrial world? The evidence remains silent on their motivations, leaving us only with the physical reality of their achievements. We see a civilization that stood at the crossroads of the East and the West, absorbing influences from the Nabateans to the south and the Mesopotamians to the north, yet ultimately forging a style that was entirely, stubbornly their own. The sheer scale of these ancient structures challenges our modern understanding of primitive technology. To build to heights of 8 or 9 stories using only sun-dried mud and straw requires an intimate knowledge of structural physics, a deep understanding of how weight is distributed and how a building breathes. These were not the works of a desperate people, but of a highly organized, wealthy, and confident society. They managed the flow of water through complex terrace systems and governed the flow of trade through fortified mountain passes. They were the masters of the heights, looking down from their clay towers upon the endless stream of wealth that flowed through their valleys. And yet, for all their power, there is a haunting quality to these early foundations. They remind us of the fragility of even the greatest empires. The incense trade would eventually falter as the Roman Empire converted to Christianity and the demand for pagan offerings plummeted, and as the maritime routes began to favor the sea over the grueling desert trek. But the architectural DNA had already been written. The vertical city was no longer just a response to a specific economic boom. It had become the cultural identity of the region. Even as the gold stopped flowing and the caravans grew thin, the people of the Hadramaut continued to build upwards, maintaining a tradition that had become as essential to their existence as the water in their wells. The mystery of these cities lies not just in how they were built, but in how they endured. While the great cities of the Silk Road were often sacked, burned, and forgotten, the skyscrapers of Yemen remained, inhabited, repaired, and whispered about in the journals of the few travellers who dared to venture so deep into the interior. They represent a rare continuity in human history, a bridge between the ancient world of the spice lords and the modern world of the 21st century. As we sit in the silence of the present, we can almost hear the echoes of that vanished era, the sound of stone chisels, the lowing of camels, and the rustle of silk in the high, cool rooms of the towers. The soil here is a graveyard of ambitions, yet the towers remain defiant. Each layer of mud applied by a modern mason is a conversation with an ancestor from 2,000 years ago. They share the same materials, the same climate, and the same vertical vision. As the evening shadows lengthen across the valley, the towers seem to grow even taller, their silhouettes merging with the ancient cliffs that have watched over them since the beginning. It is a landscape where time does not move in a straight line, but rather circles back upon itself, spiraling upward like the staircases hidden within those thick earthen walls. We are left to contemplate the endurance of this relationship, the way a specific mixture of clay and a specific pattern of rainfall could give rise to one of the most anomalous urban experiments in human history. The skyscrapers of Yemen are not just buildings, they are a dialogue between humanity and the deep, silent history of the earth itself, a conversation that continues to echo through the canyons, carried on the scent of dry earth and the cooling evening breeze. In the stillness of the desert night, the ghosts of the incense merchants seem to linger in the doorways, their wealth long gone, but their soaring legacy etched forever into the skyline of the sands. The transition from the ancient world to the medieval period in Yemen was not a collapse, but a metamorphosis. The foundations laid during the height of the incense trade provided the literal and metaphorical base for everything that was to follow. As the world around them changed, as religions shifted and empires rose and fell, the people of the towers remained, guardians of a vertical secret that the rest of the world had yet to truly grasp. They lived in the sky while the rest of the world remained rooted to the earth, creating a society that was, in every sense of the word, elevated. To understand the silhouette of these desert towers, one must first understand the sound of the wind as it carries the distant echo of a coming conflict. For over 2,000 years, the people of the Wadi Hadramaut lived in a state of perpetual, high-stakes vigilance. The geography of the desert is a paradox. It is vast and open, yet it offers nowhere to hide. In this landscape, survival was not found in the breadth of one's territory, but in the height of one's walls. The verticality of Shibam and its sister cities was not a pursuit of vanity, nor was it a mere aesthetic choice born of the incense trade's wealth. It was a biological imperative, a collective response to the reality of tribal warfare that defined the Arabian Peninsula for centuries. As the years passed, the city itself became a single, living organism of defense. The houses were not built as individual dwellings, but as interconnected pillars that formed a continuous, impenetrable curtain. To a traveller, approaching from the shimmering horizon, the city does not look like a collection of homes. It looks like a monolith, a jagged tooth of sun-dried mud rising abruptly from the dust. This was the first layer of psychological warfare, the sheer, intimidating presence of height in a world that was otherwise flat. To look up at these 7-story structures was to feel small, exposed, and vulnerable. The inhabitants, meanwhile, looked down from their rooftop terraces, possessing a tactical clarity that no ground-based army could ever hope to achieve. They could see the dust clouds of approaching riders hours before they reached the gates, turning the horizon itself into an early warning system. The internal logic of these towers is a study in the architecture of the bunker. When you stand at the base of a Hadrami skyscraper, you notice a striking absence. There are no windows. The first 2 floors are solid, heavy, and silent. These lower levels serve as the foundation of the family's survival, both literally and figuratively. In the deep shadows of these windowless ground floors, the livestock were kept, the goats and camels that represented the family's mobile wealth. Above them, in the cool, dark 2nd story, the grain was stored in massive clay jars. These floors were designed to withstand a siege, built with walls so thick they could absorb the impact of battering rams or the heat of fires set at the threshold. There is a weight to the air in these lower chambers, a sense of being buried alive within a mountain of earth, protected from the chaos of the outside world by several feet of compressed mud and straw. Moving upward through the narrow, winding staircases, the transition from darkness to light is slow and deliberate. As one ascends, the walls gradually thin, and the windows begin to appear, first as tiny, slit-like apertures for ventilation, and eventually as the ornate, carved wood lattices of the upper living quarters. This vertical stratification served a dual purpose. It kept the most valuable resources at the bottom, protected by the sheer mass of the building, while the people lived in the airy, light-filled heights, far above the reach of a stray arrow or a climbing intruder. The staircase itself was a defensive tool. Narrow and steep, it forced any attacker to move in single file, making the ascent a grueling, claustrophobic journey where the advantage always remained with those at the top. And so the city walls and the houses became one and the same. In many of these desert settlements, there is no distinction between the perimeter of the city and the back walls of the outermost homes. They are fused together into a singular, defensive shell. This design created a sense of absolute communal security. To breach the city was not merely to break through a gate, but to face a forest of towers that could rain down stones, boiling water, or arrows from every conceivable angle. The mystery lies in how such a sophisticated system was maintained across generations, through countless shifts in tribal power and the slow drying of the climate. The builders understood something fundamental about the human psyche, that in a world of uncertainty there is a profound comfort in the sky. By lifting their lives off the desert floor, they created a sanctuary that felt unreachable, a vertical fortress that whispered of permanence in a land of shifting sands. To touch the surface of a wall in Shibam is to touch the earth itself, rearranged into a shape that defies gravity through a quiet, ancient alchemy. There is no stone here, no marble, no heavy timber to bear the weight of 7 stories. Instead, there is only the union of silt and sun, a partnership between the riverbed and the sky. The construction of these desert towers begins not with a blueprint, but with the patient gathering of the wadi's sediment. The builders collect the fine alluvial clay, mixing it with water and straw in a rhythmic, physical ritual that has remained unchanged for 2,000 years. This mixture is pressed into wooden molds to form the madar, the sun-dried bricks that serve as the fundamental cells of the city's body. These bricks are never fired in a kiln. To bake them in an oven would be to strip them of their essential moisture-wicking properties, and so they are left to cure under the relentless heat of the Arabian sun. Thousands upon thousands of these rectangular blocks are laid out across the desert floor, appearing from a distance like a vast geometric harvest. As they dry, they harden into a material that is surprisingly resilient, yet remains soft to the touch, a paradox of fragility and strength. The straw within the brick acts as a natural reinforcement, a primitive form of rebar that prevents the clay from cracking as it shrinks, creating a composite material that can support the immense vertical pressure of a skyscraper. When the temperature in the valley climbs toward 40 degrees Celsius, the true genius of the madar becomes apparent. The thick mud walls act as a thermal sponge, absorbing the searing heat of the day and storing it within their dense mass. Inside the lower rooms, the air remains remarkably cool, a silent sanctuary from the shimmering haze outside. It is only as the sun sets and the desert air turns cold that the walls begin to release that stored warmth back into the living spaces, providing a natural, slow-acting furnace that regulates the rhythm of human life. The buildings do not merely stand in the desert, they breathe with it, inhaling the heat and exhaling the cool in a cycle that mimics the respiration of a living organism. However, for all their thermal brilliance, these towers are inherently vulnerable. A mud brick is a temporary thing, a guest in the landscape. Without protection, the rare but violent rains of the region would slowly melt the city back into the silt from which it rose. To prevent this, the builders employ a secondary alchemy involving limestone. They take the raw stone from the surrounding mountains and burn it in pits for days until it transforms into a fine, white powder known as nura. When mixed with water and polished with a smooth stone, this lime plaster becomes a waterproof skin, a brilliant white shield that is applied to the roofs and the uppermost floors of the towers. From the ground, the city looks like a collection of ochre giants wearing white crowns. This nura serves a dual purpose. It reflects the harshest rays of the sun away from the most exposed parts of the building, and it creates a seamless, obsidian-smooth barrier against the rain. The application of nura is a delicate art, requiring the plasterer to rub the surface repeatedly until it glows with a soft, pearlescent luster. It is a labor of love that must be repeated every few years, for the desert wind is a persistent sculptor, slowly grinding away at the protective layer with every sandstorm. This constant need for maintenance reveals the most profound truth about the desert skyscrapers. They are not static monuments, but biological entities that require a perpetual cycle of care. In the West, we build with the intention of permanence, using steel and glass that we hope will resist the passage of time without our intervention. But in Shibam, a house is only as healthy as the family that inhabits it. If a tower is abandoned, if the nura is not reapplied, or the cracks in the madar are not patched with fresh mud, the building will begin to fail within a single generation. The walls will bulge, the corners will soften, and eventually the entire structure will fold back into the earth, leaving behind nothing but a mound of dust. There is a haunting beauty in this fragility. It suggests that the city is held upright not just by physics, but by the collective will and memory of its people. To live in a mud skyscraper is to enter into a contract with the ancestors, an agreement to keep the alchemy alive. The builders understood that nothing in this world is truly permanent, and so they created a system of architecture that demands presence. They built a city that survives only because it is loved, a vertical forest of clay that must be fed and groomed like a living thing. As the years passed into centuries, this relationship between the inhabitant and the habitat created a unique urban psychology. The people of the valley do not see their homes as inanimate objects, but as extensions of their own bodies. Every crack in the plaster is a wound to be healed. Every new layer of mud is a renewal of life. This is why the skyscrapers have endured for 2 millennia despite the lack of modern foundations. They are part of a continuous, unbroken chain of human touch. They are the result of a deep ancestral knowledge that recognizes the earth is not something to be conquered, but something to be shaped, borrowed, and eventually returned. One cannot help but wonder how many other civilizations once understood this delicate balance. We look at the ruins of the world and see only the skeletons of stone, forgetting that perhaps the greatest wonders were those made of more humble materials that required a soul to keep them standing. The towers of Yemen remain as a living testament to this lost philosophy. They stand as a challenge to our modern notions of durability, proving that a house made of mud can outlast a temple of marble, provided there is a hand there to stroke its walls and a heart to call it home. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, when the shadows of the towers stretch across the canyon floor, the city seems to hum with this hidden vitality. You can smell the damp earth of a freshly patched wall, a scent that is both primal and comforting. You can see the thumbprints of the builders in the dried clay, a tactile record of 1,000 different hands that have labored to keep the sky at bay. It is a place where the boundary between the natural world and the human world has been blurred into a single, seamless reality. And as the wind whispers through the narrow alleys, carrying the scent of dust and ancient lime, one feels the weight of those 2,000 years. A long, slow breath taken by a city that refuses to sleep. The mystery of Shibam is not found in its height, nor in its age, but in its persistence. How did a culture, isolated by mountains and sand, develop a technology so perfectly attuned to its environment that it rendered modern intervention unnecessary? The alchemy of mud and straw is a science of the spirit, a realization that the most enduring structures are those that acknowledge their own mortality. By building with the earth, they ensured that their legacy would never truly die, as long as there is mud in the wadi and a sun in the sky to dry it.
Imagine, if you will, a single grain of dust dancing in a shaft of light, drifting through a window carved 50 feet above the desert floor. This light does not merely illuminate a room, it traces the invisible boundaries of a vertical society, a civilization that decided, perhaps 2,000 years ago, that the only way to live in harmony with the earth was to climb away from it. To walk through the heavy, iron-studded door of a Yemeni tower house is to step into a microcosm of the universe, where the hierarchy of life is organized not by wealth, but by the steady pull of gravity and the rising heat of the afternoon sun. There is a profound, silent logic to this arrangement, a stratigraphy of existence that mirrors the very layers of the earth from which these towers rose. At the very base of the tower, where the walls are thickest and the air holds the damp, cool scent of the subterranean, the world of the animal reigns. Here, in the dim light of the ground floor, the livestock find their sanctuary. The rhythmic sound of a goat's hoof on stone or the soft lowing of cattle echoes against the mud brick foundations, providing a living warmth that radiates upward through the structure. This is the anchor, the heavy root of the home, where the harvest is stored in dark, cool granaries, and the tools of the field lean against walls that have stood for centuries. It is a space of utility and survival, a necessary foundation for the ethereal heights above. As one begins the ascent up the narrow, winding stone staircase, the air begins to change, shedding the heavy scents of the earth and taking on the aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs. The second and third floors serve as the transition between the animal and the human, acting as a buffer against the noise and dust of the street. These are often spaces for storage or domestic labor, but as the staircase continues its spiral, the architecture begins to reflect the intricate social tapestries of the family. In these middle heights, we find the heart of the domestic sphere, where the gendered geography of the house reveals itself. The windows here are small, placed high in the walls to allow light to spill across the ceiling, while protecting the inhabitants from the prying eyes of passers-by below. It is a design of profound privacy, a way to remain connected to the sky without being exposed to the world.
Within these rooms, the women of the household move through spaces that are entirely their own, designed for comfort and the quiet rhythms of daily life, far removed from the public gaze of the Wadi. There is a peculiar mystery in how these families grew. In most civilizations, a growing family meant the clearing of more land and the outward expansion of the village, a horizontal sprawl that consumed the landscape. But here, in the shadows of the Haraz Mountains, the land was too precious to be wasted on footprints. The fields were for life, for the coffee and the grain, and so the only direction left to go was up. When a son married, or when a new generation required its own sanctuary, the family did not build a new house. They simply added another layer to the sky. They reached higher into the blue, stacking rooms like memories, until the towers reached 7, 8, or 9 stories in height. This vertical expansion created a living history of the family, a physical record of their endurance, where the oldest ancestors occupied the foundations and the newest lives flourished nearest to the clouds. One wonders if the architects of these towers felt the sway of the wind as they laid the upper bricks, or if they simply trusted in the ancient geometry that had held their grandfathers steady. As the climb nears its end, the staircase opens into the crowning glory of the Yemeni tower, the Mirage. This is the room at the very top, the highest point of the domestic mountain, and it is a space of pure transcendence. While the lower floors are thick-walled and protective, the Mirage is a pavilion of light. Large windows, often decorated with intricate stained glass, known as Qamariya, named for the moon, wrap around the room, offering panoramic views of the surrounding desert and the jagged peaks beyond. Here, in the late afternoon, the men of the family gather to rest, to talk, and to watch the shadows lengthen across the valley. The Mirage is more than just a room, it is a lookout, a place where the stresses of the physical world are left on the floors below. To sit in the Mirage is to be suspended between the earth and the heavens, a guest of the wind. But the life of the tower does not end at the ceiling of the Mirage. Beyond the windows, the rooftops themselves form a secondary city, a hidden landscape of terraces and walkways that connect the family to their neighbours. In the cool of the evening, when the sun has lost its bite, these rooftops become a communal stage. Voices carry easily through the thin mountain air, travelling from one terrace to another as news is shared and stories are told across the gaps between buildings. From above, the narrow alleys of the city disappear, and what remains is a continuous tapestry of mud and stone, a high-altitude neighbourhood where the boundaries of individual homes blur into a single, shared existence. It is a social ladder that culminates in the open air, a reminder that even in a fortress, human connection is the ultimate necessity. We must ask ourselves what it does to the human psyche to live in such a way, to spend one's life moving vertically through the world. In the modern age, we are accustomed to the elevator, a mechanical leap that erases the journey between the street and the summit. But in these ancient skyscrapers, every step is felt. The transition from the cool, dark animal stalls to the sun-drenched Mirage is a ritual performance of daily life. It is a constant reminder of one's place in the order of things, rooted in the earth, supported by the family, and always reaching for the light. The privacy afforded by these heights was not a form of isolation, but a sophisticated method of managing the density of the city. By pulling the living spaces upward, the inhabitants created a sense of vastness and solitude that would be impossible in a horizontal town of the same population. Even the placement of the windows tells a story of hidden intentions. The lower windows are often narrow slits, designed for defense and ventilation, while the upper windows become progressively more ornate and expansive. This was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a response to the climate and the social code of the desert. The high windows allowed the heat to escape while drawing in the cool breezes that skip over the tops of the dunes, creating a natural air conditioning system that has functioned perfectly for over 1,000 years. It is a technology of observation and redirection, a way of harnessing the elements without conquering them. The builders understood that to live in the desert, one must not fight the sun, but invite it in on one's own terms. As we look up at these crumbling yet defiant giants, we are forced to confront the limits of our own architectural understanding. We build with steel and glass, materials that demand enormous energy to produce and maintain, yet these towers of mud and straw have sheltered the same families for dozens of generations. They have survived earthquakes, tribal wars, and the relentless erosion of the wind. Perhaps the secret lies in the very nature of the vertical social ladder. The idea that a house is not a static object, but a growing, breathing entity that adapts to the needs of its inhabitants. It is a philosophy of permanence through change, a realization that the strongest structures are those that are built to be climbed, floor by floor, generation by generation, until the roof finally touches the stars. The scent of rain in the Wadi Hadramaut is a rare and terrifying perfume, a sharp metallic tang that cuts through the dry heat of the desert air. When the clouds finally break over the high plateaus, the water does not merely fall, it descends in a violent torrent, transforming the parched valley floors into raging rivers in a matter of minutes. For a city built entirely of sun-dried mud, these flash floods should, by all laws of physics, be a death sentence. Yet, Shibam and its sister cities have stood for 2,000 years, defying the liquid weight of the seasons through an engineering brilliance that feels almost supernatural in its foresight. At the heart of this survival is a complex understanding of fluid dynamics, etched into the very skin of the buildings. As you look up at the towering facades, you might notice subtle dark channels carved into the mud plaster, tracing intricate paths down the vertical heights. These are the Sarif drainage systems, a network of gutters and pipes crafted from a mixture of lime, ash, and sand known as kadad. This ancient waterproof cement is polished with smooth stones until it shines, becoming as hard as marble and as impermeable as glass. The Sarif does not just catch the rain, it tames it, guiding the water away from the vulnerable mud bricks and channeling it into the streets below, which are themselves designed as sloped conduits to lead the deluge toward the agricultural groves outside the walls. It is a silent, gravity-fed symphony, ensuring that even in the midst of a desert monsoon, the foundations of the skyscrapers remain bone-dry and unshakable. But the mastery of water in these vertical labyrinths was not merely about defense. It was about the daily, grueling necessity of life. Long before the hum of electric pumps or the convenience of modern plumbing, the inhabitants of these 8-story towers solved the problem of elevation with a quiet, methodical ingenuity. Imagine the rhythm of a morning 2 centuries ago, the sound of wooden pulleys creaking in the pre-dawn stillness. Water was hauled from deep communal wells, often located in the central squares or the ground floors of the towers, using thick ropes made of goat hair. It was a vertical journey of nearly 100 feet, a constant labor that treated every drop of liquid as a precious, hard-won treasure. Once the water reached the upper residential floors, it was stored in oversized ceramic jars, their porous sides allowing a small amount of evaporation to keep the contents cool despite the blistering sun outside. This careful management of resources extended into the shadows of the building's interior, where a sophisticated system of vertical shafts served as the lungs and the kidneys of the structure. These shafts, running the entire height of the building, were designed to facilitate a natural stack effect. Even on the hottest days, the difference in air pressure between the shaded base and the sun-baked roof created a gentle, upward draft, pulling fresh air through the lower windows and venting the stale heat out through the top. It was a form of passive climate control that modern architects are only now beginning to truly appreciate, a way of breathing that kept the thick mud walls from becoming heat traps. Deep within these same vertical corridors lay the secret to the city's legendary cleanliness, a waste management system that seems impossibly advanced for a civilization of the deep past. Each floor featured a small private chamber with a double-holed latrine separating liquid and solid waste at the source. The liquids were channeled through internal pipes made of fired clay or waterproofed kadad, leading to hidden tanks where they would eventually evaporate or be absorbed. The solids, meanwhile, dropped down a long dark shaft to a secure room at the base of the tower. There, in the dry heat of the desert, the waste would dehydrate rapidly, losing its odor and becoming a sterile, nitrogen-rich fertilizer that was periodically collected and carried out to the palm groves. It was a closed loop, a perfect circle of consumption and return that allowed thousands of people to live in incredibly high density without the plagues or filth that haunted the horizontal cities of medieval Europe. The mystery of how these systems were maintained over 2 millennia lies in the communal memory of the builders. There are no blueprints for the sarif, no written manuals for the pitch of the drainage pipes. Instead, the knowledge is held in the hands of the master masons, who can tell by the sound of a falling droplet whether a wall is beginning to fail. They understand that a mud city is a living thing, and like any living thing, its health depends on the flow of its fluids. They speak of the water as if it were a guest, welcome when it is guided, but a thief when it is left to wander. As the years passed and the world outside the Wadi changed, these systems remained largely untouched, a testament to a time when engineering was not about conquering nature, but about negotiating with it. There is a profound, heavy silence in the lower chambers of these towers, where the walls are thickest and the air is perpetually cool. Here, one can feel the weight of the 8 stories above, held aloft not by steel beams or concrete, but by the simple, ancient logic of dried earth and the careful redirection of the rain. We are left to wonder how a culture, isolated by the vast reaches of the Rub al-Khali desert, developed a mastery of hydraulic engineering that rivals the greatest achievements of the Roman aqueducts or the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Perhaps the answer is buried in the stratigraphy of the Wadi floor, in the layers of silt and sand that have accumulated since the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden climatic shift nearly 12,000 years ago. Could these vertical cities be the final, perfected form of a technology that began when the Sahara was still green, a ghost of a lost civilization that learned to survive the drying of the world by building upward, toward the clouds that so rarely visit them? The ingenuity of keeping a mud city dry is not just a feat of construction, it is an act of faith. Every year, before the rains come, the families of Shibam climb their wooden ladders to the rooftops, applying fresh layers of lime wash and checking the seals on their drainage channels. It is a ritual of preservation, a recognition that their survival depends on their ability to outsmart the very elements that give them life. In the stillness of the desert afternoon, as the sun bakes the kadad to a brilliant white, the towers stand as silent sentinels, their internal veins and arteries waiting for the next great flood, ready to catch the water and usher it safely back to the earth, just as they have done for 100 generations. The mystery of their endurance is not found in the strength of the mud, but in the wisdom of the flow, a wisdom that whispers of a time when man and mountain were one, and the sky was the only limit to what could be built from the dust. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a single pebble falling from a height of 300 feet, tumbling through the thin, dry air until it strikes the canyon floor with a sharp, lonely echo. In the Wadi Dawan, this sound is the only clock that matters, a reminder of the verticality that defines every breath taken in the village of Al-Jazil, while the cities of the valley floor, like Shibam, rose from the silt of the earth to mimic the mountains. Al-Jazil chose a different path. It became the mountain itself. Perched atop a monolithic boulder that rises abruptly from the valley floor like a giant's discarded toy, the village defies every law of architectural logic. It is a cluster of mud brick towers clinging to a surface so narrow and so precarious that from a distance it looks like a geological impossibility, a crown of clay resting on a pedestal of ancient stone. The spectacle of Hayd Al-Jazil is not merely in its height, but in its isolation. There are no sprawling suburbs here, no gradual transition from the wild desert to the domestic hearth. There is only the sheer, vertical drop of the cliff face and the sudden, improbable beginning of human habitation. To live here is to exist in a state of constant suspension, separated from the rest of the world by hundreds of feet of empty space. The inhabitants of this citadel are the true cliff dwellers of the desert, masters of a self-sustaining ecosystem that seems to pull its very lifeblood from the clouds. While the valley cities depend on the seasonal floods, the people of the high boulder have learned to harvest the moisture of the mists and the rare, intense rains that visit the peaks, storing every drop in cisterns carved directly into the rock. It is a closed loop of survival, a tiny vertical universe where nothing is wasted and everything is precious. As the years passed, a distinct rhythm developed that separated these mountain peak citadels from their cousins on the valley floor. Down in the Wadi, life is governed by the flow of water and the movement of caravans, a busy, dusty existence of trade and agriculture. But up on the boulder of Hayd Al-Jazil, there is a profound, heavy silence. The altitude filters out the noise of the world below, leaving only the whistling of the wind through the narrow alleys and the distant cry of a hawk circling the thermal vents. This is a lifestyle defined by the horizon, a perspective that looks out over the vast, undulating desert rather than up at the canyon walls. Here, the sky is not a distant roof, but a neighbor. The villagers move through their days with a measured grace, aware that every step is taken on the edge of an abyss, yet they feel a security that no valley dweller can truly know. Their fortress is not made of iron or steel, but of sheer distance. The mystery of how such a place came to be remains etched into the very grain of the mud bricks. Why would a community choose to haul every basket of earth, every gallon of water, and every timber for their ceilings up the face of a vertical cliff? Some suggest it was for defense, a way to remain untouched by the tribal wars that occasionally swept through the valleys like sandstorms. Others whisper of a spiritual calling, a need to be closer to the heavens, away from the heavy, stagnant air of the lowlands. In the world of archaeology, we often look for rational economic reasons for settlement patterns, examining the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris left by successive generations, to find clues of trade or resource management. But Hayd Al-Jazil seems to operate outside these earthly concerns. It is a monument to the human spirit's refusal to be grounded, a testament to the idea that home is not just where the water flows, but where the soul feels most free. The construction of these towers on such a limited surface required a level of engineering that borders on the miraculous. The foundations are fused to the living rock, utilizing the natural cracks and fissures of the boulder to anchor the massive weight of the mud brick walls. There is no room for error. A single miscalculation in the distribution of weight would cause the entire structure to succumb to the pull of gravity, tumbling into the void below. Yet these buildings have stood for centuries, surviving the tremors of the earth and the relentless scouring of the desert winds. They possess a strange organic symmetry, as if the buildings grew out of the stone like a strange species of desert flora. In the twilight hours, when the heat of the day finally begins to radiate away from the stones, the village takes on a ghostly quality. The shadows of the towers stretch across the valley floor, long and thin, like fingers reaching out to touch the distant cliffs. There is a sense of deep time here, a feeling that the village has always been part of the landscape, as much a part of the geology as the limestone and the sand. It makes one wonder about the limits of our understanding of ancient civilizations. We often assume that progress is a horizontal movement, a spreading out across the land. But here, progress is vertical. It is a climbing, a reaching, a constant striving toward the light. The silence of the high desert lifestyle is perhaps its most intoxicating quality. It is not an empty silence, but a thick, textured quiet that allows one to hear the heartbeat of the mountain. In the absence of the mechanical hum of the modern world, the senses become attuned to the smallest changes in the environment. The shift in the wind that signals a coming storm, the cooling of the air as the sun dips below the rim of the canyon, the subtle scent of dry earth and ancient dust. For the people of Al-Jazil, this silence is a sanctuary. It is the medium through which they communicate with the past, a bridge across the centuries to the ancestors who first looked at this impossible boulder and saw a home. As we look up at these gravity-defying structures, we are forced to confront the gaps in our own knowledge. We can analyze the chemical composition of the mud. We can date the timber beams using radiocarbon techniques to find they are hundreds of years old, and we can map the coordinates of every room. But the why remains elusive. The true essence of the vertical city is not found in its materials, but in the audacity of its existence. It stands as a silent challenge to our notions of what is possible, a reminder that even in the harshest, most unforgiving environments, the human imagination can find a way to soar. The boulder of Al-Jazil is more than just a piece of rock. It is a pedestal for a dream that refuses to die, a dream of living among the stars while keeping one's feet firmly planted on the ancient, sun-baked earth. The transition from the valley floor to the mountain peak is not just a change in elevation, it is a change in the very nature of being. Down below, the world is defined by the horizontal, by paths and roads and the flow of the river. But as one ascends toward the citadel, the world narrows and then suddenly expands into an infinite vista. The self-sustaining ecosystems of the cliff dwellers are a marvel of ancient wisdom, a reminder that we once knew how to live in harmony with the most extreme features of our planet. They did not try to level the mountain or fill the valley, they simply found their place within the existing architecture of the world. And so, the village remains, a cluster of towers reaching for the sky, a lonely, beautiful sentinel in the vast, echoing silence of the Yemeni desert. The air at this altitude is different. It is sharper, cleaner, carrying with it the taste of the high plateau and the distant sea. It is an air that demands a certain kind of lungs and a certain kind of spirit. To live in Al-Jazil is to be a part of the wind. As the night deepens and the stars begin to crowd the sky, the village seems to detach from the earth entirely, floating in a sea of darkness, a tiny island of light and life in the middle of a vast, prehistoric ocean of stone. The mystery of its endurance is the mystery of the human heart, a heart that, when faced with a sheer cliff and a barren horizon, chooses to build upward, ever upward, until it touches the very edge of the infinite. A single resonant chime echoes across the valley, carried on the cool air of the pre-dawn hours, a sound that has marked the passage of time for over 1,000 years. This is the call from the minaret, a sound that signaled not just a change in faith, but a fundamental shift in how these vertical labyrinths were organized. As the 7th century unfolded, the arrival of Islam flowed through the narrow wadis of Yemen like a slow-moving river, reshaping the social and physical landscape without ever erasing the ancient foundations beneath. In cities like Shibam and Sana'a, the introduction of this new way of life brought with it a sophisticated sense of urban geometry, a logic of the spirit that demanded a central anchor for the rising towers. The great mosque became that anchor, a heavy, grounded heart around which the tall houses clustered like silent sentinels,
Before this era, the vertical sprawl of the desert was perhaps more chaotic, a collection of clan-based fortresses vying for the highest vantage point. But with the influence of Islamic urban planning, the city began to breathe as a single organism. The mosque provided the open courtyard, the void in the density, the one place where the verticality of the private home surrendered to the horizontal vastness of the communal. Everything flowed toward this center. The narrow alleys, barely wide enough for two men to pass, were designed to lead the wandering foot toward the call of the prayer hall, creating a circulatory system that kept the lifeblood of the city moving even in the stifling heat of midsummer. As you look closer at the grain of the wood and the texture of the stone, you begin to see how the new faith integrated itself into the very skin of the architecture. The heavy doors of jujube wood and the delicate window frames began to carry the weight of the word. Calligraphy, the art of the sacred line, began to wind its way around the portals, weaving prayers into the cedar and teak. These were not merely decorations, they were seen as protective talismans, a layer of spiritual armor for the family living within. The artisans of the era possessed a patience that is difficult for us to grasp today. They spent months carving a single mashrabiyah, those intricate wooden screens that allow the women of the house to look out at the world while remaining invisible to the street below. These screens are masterpieces of geometry, composed of thousands of turned wood pieces joined without a single nail, a mathematical prayer that filters the harsh desert sun into a soft, dappled patterns of light and shadow on the interior floors. Yet in this transition, something remarkable happened, a preservation of the deep past that defies typical historical patterns. While the names of the gods changed, the hands of the builders remained faithful to motifs that had existed for 2 millennia. If you examine the friezes of the great mosque of Sana'a, a structure said to have been founded during the lifetime of the Prophet, you will find stones repurposed from older pre-Islamic palaces. You see the carvings of the ibex, the ancient symbol of the moon god Al-Makka, sitting quietly alongside the geometric patterns of the Islamic era. The builders did not see this as a contradiction, they saw it as a continuity of craft. The zigzag patterns that represent water in the ancient Sabaean script continued to be carved into the mud brick facades of the skyscrapers, a silent plea for rain that has remained unchanged since the time of the Queen of Sheba. There is a profound mystery in this layering of time. We often think of history as a series of clean breaks, of one civilization rising on the ruins of another. But in the desert cities of Yemen, the past is never truly buried. It is folded into the present. The Islamic influence did not sweep away the vertical tradition. It refined it, giving it a new vocabulary of arches and domes to complement the jagged peaks of the towers. The integration of geometric art into the architecture reflects a deep understanding of the cosmos, a belief that the physical world is a reflection of a higher, hidden order. Every square, every circle, and every interlocking star carved into a window frame is a meditation on the infinite. As the years passed, the mosque and the market, the SUQ, became the twin lungs of the city. The verticality of the houses provided the privacy and the defense, while the mosque provided the shared identity. But even as the city grew more sophisticated, it never lost its connection to the earth. The materials remained the same, the sun-dried mud, the straw, the lime plaster known as kadad. This plaster, a mixture of lime, volcanic ash, and oils, is polished with smooth stones until it shines like marble. A technique that has been passed down through generations of masons, a secret language of the hands that predates the written word. It is this kadad that protects the tops of the towers from the rare but torrential rains,
a white cap that makes the city look, from a distance, like a cluster of snow-peaked mountains rising from the dust. In the quiet of the afternoon, when the sun is at its zenith and the city retreats into the shadows, one can feel the weight of these 14 centuries. The transition to the Islamic era was not a conquest of stone, but a conversation between the old and the new. The ancient skyscrapers, which had already stood for hundreds of years, simply adjusted their shadows to accommodate the minarets. They shared the same wind, the same dust, and the same relentless sun. This period of history reminds us that true endurance is found not in resistance, but in the ability to absorb new ideas while holding fast to the wisdom of the ancestors. The mystery remains. Why did this specific corner of the world cling so fiercely to the vertical? While other great Islamic cities like Baghdad or Cairo expanded across the plains, the people of the Wadi Hadramaut and the Yemeni highlands continued to stack room upon room, floor upon floor. Perhaps it was a spiritual necessity as much as a practical one. In a land of such vast horizontal emptiness, the only way to find one's place was to look up. The mosque gave them a reason to gather, but the towers gave them a way to reach. As the evening shadows begin to stretch across the valley floor, the whitewashed decorative motifs of the upper stories seem to glow with an inner light, a reminder of a time when art, faith, and survival were all carved from the same piece of earth. And so, the city stands as a testament to a long, unbroken dream, a dream of a place where the sacred and the mundane are separated only by a flight of stairs, where the call to prayer drifts through windows carved with symbols of a forgotten age, and where the architecture of the desert remains, as it has always been, a bridge between the dust of the ground and the clarity of the stars. The Islamic era did not end the mystery of the towers. It simply added a new chapter to a story that was already ancient when the world was young. The towers remain, silent and watchful, waiting for the next cycle of time to turn, while the desert wind continues its endless work of smoothing the edges of the stone, whispering secrets that only the oldest walls can understand. In the deep, resonant stillness of the Hadramaut, there is a sound that precedes the rising of any wall, a sound that has echoed through the wadis for 2 millennia before a single brick is ever laid. It is not the scratching of a pen on parchment, nor the unfurling of a master's plan, for in this corner of the world, the architecture of the giants exists only in the mind and the memory. To look upon the vertical cities of Yemen is to witness a miracle of geometry that defies the modern necessity for blueprints. There are no sketches here, no mathematical proofs scrawled on paper, no digital models to calculate the stress and strain of 10-story towers made of mud. Instead, there is only the ancestral gaze, a way of seeing that has been passed from father to son through a lineage of master builders who carry the city's future in their very marrow. These men are the keepers of a silent language, a tradition where the earth itself is whispered into the sky, guided by nothing more than the practiced intuition of the human eye. As you walk through the narrow, cooling shadows of Shibam or Tarim, you might wonder how such precarious heights remain stable against the shifting sands and the relentless pull of gravity. The secret lies in a technique of eyeballing that transcends mere estimation. The master builder stands at the base of the construction, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the desert sun, measuring the verticality of a 100-foot tower against the horizon. He does not use a spirit level or a plumb line in the way a Western engineer might. Rather, he feels the balance of the structure in his own body, sensing the subtle tilt of a wall or the weight of a corner, as if it were an extension of his own frame. It is a form of organic engineering, a deep, subconscious understanding of physics that has been refined over 80 generations. They understand that the mud, mixed with straw and left to bake in the heat, is a living thing, and that to build high
One must allow the building to breathe and settle into the earth, finding its own center of gravity through a series of minute, intuitive adjustments. This knowledge is not shared lightly. It is guarded within the ancient guilds of the Hadramaut, a closed circle of wisdom, where the secrets of the Ustad, or master, are revealed only to those who have proven their devotion through decades of service. The apprentice system here is a slow, methodical journey into the heart of the craft. A young man might spend years simply learning the temperament of the clay, feeling the grit between his fingers, understanding how the moisture leaves the brick at different times of the day. He learns the secret ratios of the foundations, those hidden depths that must be dug to support the weight of a skyscraper. He learns that a wall must be thicker at the base and taper almost imperceptibly as it reaches for the clouds, a trick of the eye that provides both structural integrity and an illusion of even greater height. These guilds operate as a living library, an oral archive of architectural triumphs and failures that stretches back to the time of the Himyarite kings. To them, a building is not a product of industry, but a sacred trust, a vessel for the soul of the community that must be built with a purity of intent that no machine could ever replicate. When the construction begins, the silence of the desert is broken by a rhythmic pulse, a sonic architecture that is as essential to the tower as the mud itself. The workers do not labor in a vacuum of exertion. They move to the cadence of ancient chants. As the heavy buckets of earth are passed from hand to hand, climbing higher and higher up the scaffolding of palm wood, a lead singer begins a verse and the crew responds in a deep, melodic unison. These chants are more than mere work songs. They are the metronome of the building's creation. The rhythm ensures that every movement is synchronized, that every brick is laid with the same force and timing, creating a structural harmony that vibrates through the very walls. It is said by the elders that the music helps the mud to set, that the vibrations of the human voice settle the particles of earth into a more perfect union. As the sun moves across the sky, the tempo of the chants shifts, slowing during the heat of the afternoon to preserve the worker's breath, then rising in a fever of celebration as the final pinnacle of the roof is reached. In this atmosphere of song and shared labor, the distinction between the builder and the building begins to blur. The towers are not constructed in the modern sense of the word. They are grown, rising out of the ground like the date palms that surround them, fueled by the collective breath of the men who sing them into existence. There is a profound patience in this process, a rejection of the hurried pace of the outside world. A single tower may take months or even years to complete, as the builders wait for each level to dry and harden completely before daring to add the next. They are working with deep time, aware that their ancestors built walls that have stood for 5 centuries, and that their own work will be judged by the generations yet unborn, who will sleep within these cool earthen chambers. This is a world where the hand of the craftsman is never hidden. Every ripple in the plaster, every slight curve in the window frame, is a testament to a human decision made in the moment, a response to the specific quality of the light or the texture of the mud on that particular day. As the years pass and the desert wind scours the exterior of these monuments, the Ustad returns to inspect his work, looking for the telltale cracks that signal a need for renewal. The maintenance of these skyscrapers is a perpetual ritual, a constant dialogue between the builder and the elements. They use a special waterproof lime plaster called kadad, a mixture of lime and volcanic ash that is rubbed into the surface with smooth stones for weeks until it shines like marble. This, too, is done to the rhythm of a chant, a slow circular motion that seals the building against the rare but torrential rains of the highlands.
It is a labor of love that requires an almost meditative state of mind, a willingness to lose oneself in the repetitive motion of the hand against the wall. One cannot help but feel that there is something lost in our modern world of steel and glass, something vital that remains preserved here in the dust of Yemen. In the Hadramaut, the building is a reflection of the man, and the man is a reflection of the earth. There is no separation. When a master builder looks at a finished tower, he does not see a feat of engineering. He sees a story told in mud, a song that has taken physical form. The mystery of how these towers stand is not found in a laboratory or a computer simulation, but in the call and response of the workers on the scaffolding, and in the quiet confidence of a master who knows, without a shadow of a doubt, that his eye is truer than any instrument. The towers remain as they have always been, monuments to a form of knowledge that does not require proof, only practice. They are the result of a civilization that chose to build upward, not out of vanity, but as a way to touch the divine while keeping their feet firmly planted in the soil of their fathers. And as the twilight deepens over the valley, the shadows of the skyscrapers stretch out across the sand, long and thin, like the fingers of a giant reaching back into the past, searching for the first note of the song that started it all.
Imagine, if you can, the sound of a fountain pen scratching against parchment in a tent buffeted by the dry, hot winds of the Rub al-Khali. It is the 1930s, and the world is beginning to map its final frontiers. Yet the Hadramaut Valley remains a void on the charts, a place of rumours and ghosts. Into this silence stepped Freya Stark, a woman whose name would become synonymous with the courage to look where others turned away. She travelled not as a conqueror, but as a witness, carrying with her a sense of profound reverence for a landscape that seemed to exist outside the reach of the 20th century. When she first glimpsed the towers of Shibam and the surrounding citadels, she did not see a primitive outpost. She saw what she would later describe as the Forbidden City, a vertical dream rising from the dust, as elegant and improbable as a mirage that refused to vanish upon closer inspection. The reports she sent back, accompanied by her grainy, evocative photographs, were met with a wave of quiet disbelief in the drawing rooms of London and Paris. To the cartographers of the era, the idea of 8-story skyscrapers built entirely of mud, standing in the heart of one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth, defied the established logic of architectural evolution. They looked at the photographs of these slender, white-crowned monoliths and saw something that belonged in a future they had not yet reached, or perhaps a past they had entirely forgotten. There was a cognitive dissonance in the sight of such verticality in a place where the horizon was the only constant. It was as if the inhabitants had bypassed the horizontal sprawl of the industrial world, leaping directly from the nomadic tent to the high-rise apartment, all while using nothing but the earth beneath their fingernails. This isolation was not accidental. The geography of Yemen, with its jagged mountain ranges and the vast, shifting sands of the empty quarter, acted as a natural vault, preserving a way of life that had remained largely unchanged for 2,000 years. The region became a living time capsule, a pocket of deep time where the rhythms of the day were dictated by the movement of the sun and the seasonal flow of the wadis. While the rest of the globe was being stitched together by telegraph wires and steamships, the valley of the Hadramaut remained a world apart, guarded by tribes who viewed the outside world with a mixture of suspicion and indifference. The skyscrapers were not built to impress travellers, for there were none. They were built as a necessity of survival, a way to keep the community safe within the narrow confines of the valley walls, while remaining above the reach of the flash floods that could turn the desert floor into a roiling river in a matter of minutes. Freya Stark documented these structures with a meticulous eye, noting how the light played across the textured walls, which were coated in a lime wash that shone like silver in the moonlight. But beneath the romanticism of her prose lay a harsh, unyielding reality. To live in a desert skyscraper was to participate in a constant struggle against the elements. The heat in the lower stories could be stifling, and the climb to the upper reaches was a daily tax on the body. There was no plumbing as we understand it, no electricity to hum in the background of the night. Life was lived in a vertical hierarchy, with the livestock often occupying the ground floor, their warmth rising through the house, while the upper floors were reserved for the family and the reception of guests. It was a life of extreme proximity and shared breath, a communal existence where every footstep on the stairs echoed through the history of the lineage that had built the walls. As the years passed and more explorers attempted to penetrate the interior, the mystery of these cities only deepened. How had a civilization, so far removed from the centers of Mediterranean or Mesopotamian power, mastered the structural engineering required to balance such weight on foundations of clay? The early researchers struggled to find a precedent. They looked for the influence of the Romans or the Persians, but the architecture of Yemen was stubbornly indigenous. It was a vernacular language of stone and straw that had been refined over millennia, a slow accumulation of wisdom passed from father to son through the medium of the hands. The skyscrapers were not the product of a single architect's vision, but the result of a collective memory, a biological imperative to rise above the dust. The romanticized view of the Manhattan of the desert often obscures the sheer grit required to maintain these structures. A mud brick house is a living thing. It requires constant care, a perpetual cycle of replastering and repair. To neglect the walls for even a few seasons is to invite the desert to reclaim them. The beauty that Freya Stark captured was a fragile beauty, one that existed only because of the relentless labor of the people who called these towers home. They were living in a monument that was simultaneously ancient and brand new, as the outer skin of the buildings was constantly being shed and renewed. This process of eternal return is perhaps why the cities feel so timeless. They are not static ruins, but organisms that breathe with the seasons. In the journals of those early travelers, one senses a feeling of displacement, a realization that their own modern world was perhaps less stable than these towers of earth. The skyscrapers of Yemen stood as a silent critique of the fleeting nature of steel and glass. In the deep silence of the desert night, the explorers lay in their tents, looking up at the silhouettes of the towers against a tapestry of stars, and felt the weight of forgotten ages pressing down upon them. They were standing in the presence of a solution to the human condition that did not require the exploitation of the earth, but rather a profound partnership with it. And as we look back through the lens of their discovery, we are left to wonder how many other secrets remain buried in the folds of the sand, waiting for a traveler with the patience to listen to what the wind has to say. The mystery of the vertical cities is not just a question of how they were built, but why they have endured while so many other civilizations have crumbled into the strata of the earth. In the context of deep time, 2,000 years is but a heartbeat. Yet in the history of human habitation, it is an eternity of continuity. The isolation that kept Yemen a mystery to the west was also its greatest protector, allowing the skyscrapers to remain as they were, unbowed by the pressures of a rapidly changing world. They remain as sentinels of a different kind of progress, one that measures success not by the speed of its movement, but by the height of its reach and the depth of its roots in the soil. As the narration continues, we find ourselves moving deeper into the narrow alleys of these mountain-shadowed towns, where the air is cool and smells of frankincense and old dust. The stories of the explorers provide the map, but the true heart of the city lies in the spaces they could not see. The private courtyards, the whispered prayers in the high rooms, and the ancient songs that still hum in the marrow of the mud walls. We are guests in a house of memories, walking softly so as not to wake the ghosts of those who first looked at a handful of dirt and saw the possibility of a ladder to the heavens. The sound of water is usually a blessing in the desert, a rare and musical gift that brings the promise of life to the parched wadis. But for the towering giants of Shibam and Tarim,
the sound of rain has begun to carry a different, more ominous note. It is the sound of a slow undoing. In recent years, the sky has become unpredictable, yielding sudden, violent downpours that the ancestors of these lands could never have anticipated. These are not the gentle seasonal mists of memory, but heavy, relentless torrents that test the very limits of sun-dried earth. When the rain falls with such unprecedented force, it does not merely soak the ground. It begins to search for the smallest fracture in the high walls, the tiniest gap in the protective skin of the buildings, seeking a way to return the monumental towers to the dust from which they were born. As we look up at these earthen skyscrapers, we are seeing a delicate balance between the elements and human will, a balance that is now tilting toward a quiet catastrophe. The secret to their survival for 2,000 years has always been the nura. This is a traditional waterproof coating made from limestone, slaked in water for weeks and then hand-rubbed into the exterior surfaces until it glows with a soft, bone-white sheen. It is a labor of love and a labor of necessity. The nura acts as a shield, a sacrificial layer that fends off the heat and the occasional storm. But nura is not eternal. It requires constant renewal, a rhythmic cycle of maintenance that has been passed down through generations of master masons. In times of economic hardship, when the resources of the valley are stretched thin, and the hands of the young are pulled toward the cities of the coast or the oil fields of the north, this cycle begins to falter. The white coating thins, it cracks, and through those cracks the rain enters the heart of the mud. There is a specific, haunting term used by those who live among these towers to describe the ultimate failure of a building. They call it melting. It is a slow-motion tragedy that occurs when a mud skyscraper is neglected for too long. Without the protective shell of nura, the moisture seeps into the thick, straw-reinforced bricks. The earth softens. The structural integrity, once so formidable that it could support 8 stories of living space, begins to give way under its own immense weight. The walls do not shatter like glass or crumble like stone. They soften, losing their sharp edges and their vertical resolve until a 1,000-year-old home looks like a candle that has burned down in the wind. To see a tower melt is to witness the erasure of history, a silent collapse that leaves behind only a mound of silt and the echoes of the families who once looked out from its highest windows. And so, a quiet migration is taking place within the valley, one that is less about distance and more about the materials of existence. Many families are making the difficult choice to leave their ancestral towers for modern housing made of concrete and steel. These new structures are easier to maintain. They do not require the constant vigilance of the mason, nor do they fear the rain. But in choosing the permanence of concrete, something ancient and breathing is lost. The concrete houses do not breathe with the rhythm of the desert. They hold the heat of the day like a fever and offer none of the cool, earthen silence of the mud walls. The transition represents a fundamental shift in how humans relate to their environment, moving from a state of symbiotic care to a state of artificial insulation. The difficulty of maintaining these vertical cities is compounded by the deep time they represent. We are not just looking at buildings, we are looking at a living stratigraphy of human effort. Stratigraphy is a term used by archaeologists to describe the layers of history buried in the earth, where the oldest stories are found at the bottom and the newest at the top. In Yemen, this stratigraphy is vertical. Each floor of a skyscraper might represent a different era of a family's history, with foundations that may date back to the pre-Islamic kingdoms. When a family abandons a tower, they are not just leaving a house, they are stepping out of a continuous lineage that has defied the desert for 2 millennia. The risk of neglect is not merely a matter of aesthetics. It is a loss of a unique architectural intelligence that mainstream science is only beginning to fully appreciate.
These buildings are masterpieces of passive cooling and structural flexibility, designed to sway slightly with the wind rather than resist it with rigid force. They are lessons in sustainability from a time before the word existed. Yet, as the economic pressures of the modern world collide with the shifting patterns of the global climate, these lessons are being washed away. The unprecedented rainfall acts as a catalyst, accelerating the natural decay that time has always threatened. As the years pass, the silhouette of the valley changes. Where once there was a seamless horizon of earthen peaks, there are now gaps, like missing teeth in a giant's jaw. Each gap represents a tower that could no longer hold its ground against the water. Meanwhile, the remaining towers stand as sentinels of a fading era, their white-capped roofs gleaming under a sun that seems increasingly harsh. The question of their survival remains unanswered, hanging in the still, dusty air of the Wadi. Can a civilization built on the principle of constant renewal survive in an age of rapid, unpredictable change? The fragility of the earth is never more apparent than when it is stacked 6 stories high. We feel the weight of forgotten ages in every hand-pressed brick and every smoothed corner of the Nura. It is a reminder that even the most magnificent achievements of humanity are ultimately on loan from the ground beneath our feet. We walk through the narrow alleys of Shibam, feeling the coolness of the shadows, and we realize that we are witnessing a struggle between the enduring spirit of the past and the dissolving forces of the present. The ghosts of the first builders, those who looked at a handful of dirt and saw a ladder to the heavens, seem to watch from the high terraces, wondering if the hands of the future will be as patient and as careful as their own. The silence of a melting tower is perhaps the most profound sound in the desert. It is the sound of a story returning to the silence of the dunes, a slow surrender that reminds us of the limits of what we can preserve. As the moisture works its way through the ancient clay, the very marrow of the city seems to sigh. It is a patient mystery, this process of return, a reminder that in the eyes of deep time, even the tallest skyscraper is but a temporary monument to a dream of height. We are left to wonder about the secrets that vanish when these walls give way. What inscriptions, what hidden chambers, what fragments of old songs are buried in the silt of a collapsed home? The desert does not give up its treasures easily, and when it takes them back, it does so with a quiet, unrelenting grace. The fragility of these structures is their beauty, a testament to the fact that they were never meant to be static monuments, but living things that required the breath and the touch of human beings to stay upright. Without that touch, the earth simply reclaims its own, leaving us to contemplate the shadows of what once reached so boldly toward the stars. To walk through the narrow, shaded alleyways of Shibam is to step into a rhythm of maintenance that has remained unchanged for 2,000 years, a cycle of application and erosion that defines the very heartbeat of the city. Yet, as the modern world accelerated around these mud brick walls, the delicate balance between the earth and the sky began to falter, prompting a global recognition of what might be lost if the desert were allowed to finish its slow meal. It was in 1982 that the international community turned its collective gaze toward the Hadramaut Valley, officially designating Shibam as a World Heritage Site under the protection of UNESCO. This was not merely a title or a line in a ledger, but an acknowledgement that these towering structures represent a pinnacle of human ingenuity, a vertical marvel that belongs not just to Yemen, but to the shared memory of our species. The designation sought to freeze the slow decay, to cast a protective net over the 600 or so towers that cluster together like a forest of stone and clay. However, the recognition brought with it a complex set of questions about how one preserves a living, breathing organism. A city is not a museum, it is a vessel for life, and the needs of a modern population often rub against the rigid requirements of historical preservation. The challenge lies in the fact that these buildings are made of the very ground upon which they stand,
and without the constant, laborious application of fresh mud and lime, they begin to return to that ground. In the late 20th century, as young men moved away to the cities or sought work across the borders, the ancient knowledge of the master masons began to thin, leaving the towers vulnerable to the elements. As the years passed, organizations such as the Aga Khan Historic Cities Program stepped into this silence, providing the funding and the expertise needed to bridge the gap between ancient tradition and modern survival. These restoration projects were not about replacing the old with the new, but about reviving the techniques that had sustained the city for millennia. They sought out the few remaining craftsmen who understood the precise alchemy of the mud, how to mix it with straw, how to let it ferment until it reached the perfect consistency, and how to apply the qadad, a traditional lime plaster, so that it could repel the rare but violent rains that occasionally scour the valley. There is a profound, quiet beauty in watching these restoration efforts unfold. It is a slow process, one that defies the frantic pace of modern construction. A single tower might take months to stabilize, as workers carefully peel back layers of weathered earth to reveal the original timber frames, some of which have held the weight of the sky for centuries. In several remarkable success stories, towers that had begun to lean precariously, their foundations softened by moisture or their upper stories crumbling into dust, were brought back from the very brink of collapse. These are the miracles of Shibam, where a building that seemed destined to become a mound of dirt is painstakingly coaxed back into its upright, proud posture, standing once again as a sentinel in the sand. Yet this restoration work exists within a constant, palpable tension. The inhabitants of Shibam are not relics of a bygone era. They are people of the 21st century who require electricity, plumbing, and connectivity. Integrating these modern necessities into a 2,000-year-old mud structure is a task of immense delicacy. A leaking pipe in a modern concrete building is an inconvenience. In a mud brick tower, it is a slow-motion catastrophe, a silent killer that can dissolve the structural integrity of a home from the inside out. The preservationists must therefore balance the purity of the architecture with the dignity of the residents, ensuring that the city remains a place where families can thrive rather than a hollow shell kept upright for the benefit of wandering tourists. Meanwhile, the shadow of global instability and local conflict always looms over the valley, threatening the fragile pipeline of international support and the steady hands of the restorers. The world watches from a distance, aware that the survival of Shibam depends on a thin thread of continuity that could be snapped by a single season of neglect. We are left to wonder about the deep time that these walls have witnessed, and how many times throughout history the city has faced such crossroads. Was there a moment, perhaps 1,000 years ago, when the people of the Hadramaut also feared for the future of their vertical home? The archaeology of the site suggests a long history of rebuilding, a layered stratigraphy of human effort where each generation builds upon the ruins of the one that came before. In this way, the work funded by global heritage organizations is simply the latest chapter in a story that began long before the rise of modern empires. It is a testament to the enduring power of the vertical dream, the strange and beautiful insistence of a desert people to live among the clouds, even when the earth itself seems to be pulling them back down. As the sun sets and the towers cast their long, jagged shadows across the valley floor, the work of the masons continues in the quiet corners of the city, a soft scratching of tools against clay, a rhythmic reminder that as long as there is a hand to apply the mud, the skyscrapers of the desert will continue to touch the stars. The weight of 1,000 years does not rest upon the ground in the Wadi Hadramaut. Instead, it climbs. We are left to wonder at the specific impulse that drove these ancient architects to discard the horizontal expanses of the desert floor in favor of a narrow, perilous ascent toward the heavens. In the surrounding territories, across the vast and shifting sands of the empty quarter, and into the rugged mountains of the Hijaz. Other cultures looked at the same mud, the same straw, and the same scorching sun, yet they chose the path of least resistance. They built wide, low-slung dwellings that hugged the earth, seeking coolness in the shadows of thick, squat walls. But in Yemen, the logic of the desert was inverted. Here, the earth was not a floor, but a foundation for a vertical ambition that remains, to this day, one of the most profound anomalies of the ancient world. Scholars have long debated the practicalities of this verticality, searching for a singular, rational explanation that would satisfy the modern mind's need for order. Perhaps, some suggest, it was a matter of space-saving, a way to preserve the precious, fertile silt of the valley floor for agriculture while the people lived above. In a land where water is more valuable than gold, every inch of arable soil was a lifeline, and to build a sprawling city upon it would be to invite starvation. Others point to the harsh realities of tribal warfare and the constant threat of desert raids. A tall tower is a fortress, a high vantage point from which one can see the dust clouds of an approaching enemy hours before they reach the gates. From these heights, the inhabitants could rain down stones or boiling liquids, turning their homes into impenetrable pillars of clay. And yet, as we look closer at the sheer scale and the intricate artistry of these structures, the purely functional arguments begin to feel thin, like a garment that no longer fits the body it was meant to cover. If defense were the only goal, why the elaborate lattice windows? Why the delicate white gypsum tracery that adorns the upper stories like frozen lace? There is an element of ego here, a silent competition between families and clans to see whose peaks could pierce the blue most boldly. It is a vertical language of prestige, a way of saying that even in a landscape defined by emptiness and the crushing weight of the sun, a human being can stand tall. It is the defiance of the horizon, a refusal to be swallowed by the vastness of the sands. When we compare these towers to the architecture of neighboring desert cultures, the mystery only deepens. The Nabateans carved their glory into the living rock of Petra, while the civilizations of Mesopotamia built massive ziggurats to reach their gods, but neither birthed a tradition of high-rise urban living for the common citizen. Yemen stands alone in this regard, a solitary island of verticality in a sea of horizontal traditions. There is no clear lineage of influence, no slow migration of ideas from elsewhere that explains why, 2,000 years ago, the people of the Hadramaut decided to build the world's first skyscrapers. It seems to have emerged from the very spirit of the place, a unique alchemy of necessity, pride, and a creative spark that ignored the limitations of its materials. The soil used to create these towers is simple alluvium, mud deposited by the seasonal floods known as wadis. It is a material that, by all rights, should crumble under the pressure of its own weight once it reaches a certain height. To stack this earth, 7, 8, or 9 stories high requires a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering that predates the modern era by millennia. The masons of Shibam and Sana'a mastered the art of the tapering wall, making the base of the tower thick and heavy, while the upper levels become thinner and lighter, allowing the structure to breathe and flex with the wind. They understood the rhythm of the seasons, knowing exactly when to apply a new coat of protective lime and mud to prevent the rare but torrential rains from melting their homes back into the valley floor. This endurance is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Yemeni skyline. In our modern age, we build with steel and glass, materials designed to resist the elements through sheer artificial strength, yet we often find ourselves living in structures that feel temporary, devoid of a soul. The mud skyscrapers, however, are organic. They are born of the earth and must be constantly nourished by human hands to survive. There is a profound intimacy in this relationship, a cycle of care that has continued unbroken for 20 centuries. Each layer of mud applied to the facade is a prayer for the future, a commitment to keep the vertical dream alive for one more generation. As the years pass and the world outside these valleys changes with dizzying speed, the towers remain as a symbol of human resilience. They remind us that creativity is not dependent on advanced technology or abundant resources, but on the depth of the human spirit and its capacity to imagine something more than what is simply necessary. The skyscrapers of the desert were not built because they were easy or because they were the most logical solution to a problem. They were built because the people who lived here looked at the dust of the earth and saw the potential for something magnificent. They saw a way to climb out of the shadows and into the light. In the quiet of the desert night, when the wind whistles through the high, narrow alleys and the moon illuminates the whitewashed crests of the towers, the enigma of the Yemeni spirit feels almost tangible. It is a spirit that refuses to be diminished by time or by the harshness of its environment. We may never fully explain why these cities rose where they did, or why this specific culture chose to live among the stars while others stayed rooted to the ground. But perhaps the explanation is not what we truly need. Perhaps it is enough to simply look up, to feel the weight of these forgotten ages, and to marvel at the courage of those who first decided that a house could be a mountain. The skyscrapers of Yemen stand as a testament to the fact that even in the most remote corners of our world, there are stories written in stone and clay that defy our understanding. They are the echoes of a lost civilization that never truly left, a vertical legacy that continues to challenge our perceptions of what is possible. As we drift further into the stillness of the desert evening, the jagged silhouette of the towers serves as a final, quiet reminder that as long as there is a horizon, there will be those who seek to rise above it, building their dreams one handful of mud at a time until they touch the very edge of the infinite. A cooling breath begins to stir from the depths of the limestone canyons, carrying with it the faint, dry scent of sun-baked earth and wild thyme. It is a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a signal that the searing heat of the daylight hours has finally surrendered to the approaching calm. As the light softens, the long violet shadows of the towers stretch across the valley floor like the fingers of a giant, reaching out to touch the crumbling ruins of older, forgotten foundations. The desert is reclaiming its stillness. In this quiet transition, the sharp, vertical lines of the skyscrapers seem to lose their rigidity, blending into the charcoal outlines of the cliffs that have stood watch over this place for millions of years. High above the narrow alleys, the evening call to prayer begins to rise, its melodic cadence echoing off the high mud walls. The sound travels upward, bouncing from one facade to another, weaving through the latticework windows and over the rooftop terraces where families gather to catch the first cool breeze. It is a sound that has defined the rhythm of life here for centuries, a human voice crying out into the vastness of the sands, anchoring the people of the Wadi to the present moment, even as they live within the architecture of the deep past. The echoes linger in the still air, a haunting reminder of the continuity of faith and the endurance of culture in a landscape that often feels indifferent to the passage of time. And so, the noise of the day, the clatter of goats, the calls of the market, the distant hum of life, fades into a profound, heavy silence that only the deep desert can truly provide. As the last traces of amber light vanish from the highest pinnacles, the first stars begin to pierce the darkening canopy of the sky. They appear one by one, brilliant and steady, unaffected by the dust of the world below. To look up from the base of a 500-year-old tower is to see the same celestial map that guided the incense caravans 2 millennia ago. The stars are the only things older than the mud beneath our feet, and in their cold, distant glow, The vertical cities of Yemen take on a spectral quality. They are no longer just buildings, they are monuments to a specific kind of human defiance, a refusal to be swallowed by the horizon, a stubborn insistence on reaching for the heavens using nothing more than the ground itself. One cannot help but wonder about the countless generations who have stood on these same rooftops, looking out at the same constellations, perhaps asking the same questions about their place in the universe. The mud of the walls contains the DNA of the valley, mixed with water and straw and the sweat of labourers whose names have long since been erased from memory. These structures are organic, breathing entities that require constant care, a perpetual cycle of renewal that mirrors the lives of the people who inhabit them. If the maintenance stops, the desert will eventually take them back, melting them down into the silt and sand from which they rose. It is a fragile permanence, a delicate balance between the creative will of man and the erosive power of nature. The mystery of why these cities were built with such vertical ambition remains partially shielded by the darkness. While scholars point to the needs of defense or the scarcity of arable land, there is a lingering sense that something more profound was at play, a cultural impulse to create a sanctuary of height in a world of flat, punishing vistas. Perhaps it was a way to stay connected to the cooling winds, or perhaps it was a symbolic gesture, a way to build a ladder to the divine. As the night deepens, the towers become indistinguishable from the natural rock formations, and the distinction between what was made by hand and what was shaped by the elements begins to blur. We are left with the realization that our understanding of history is often just a collection of fragments, a few pages salvaged from a book that has mostly been burned by time. The desert is a master of erasure. It buries civilizations beneath dunes and scours the names from headstones with the relentless grit of the wind. Yet here in the heart of the Wadi, the vertical legacy persists. It stands as a testament to the ingenuity of those who understood the secrets of the earth, who knew how to turn a handful of mud into a fortress and a home. The skyscrapers of Yemen are a bridge between the ancient world and our own, a reminder that even in the most inhospitable environments, the human spirit finds a way to flourish, to build, and to transcend the limitations of its surroundings. They remind us that our time on this earth is brief, a mere flicker compared to the life of the stones, yet within that flicker, we are capable of creating wonders that can withstand the turning of the ages. As the cool air settles into the valley and the constellations wheel slowly overhead, a profound peace descends upon the landscape. The towers are dark now, their whitewashed trim catching the faint glimmer of the Milky Way, appearing like ghosts of a future that has already passed. The heat of the day is a distant memory, and the worries of the modern world seem to dissolve in the face of such ancient, quiet majesty. There is a comfort in this stillness, a sense of being held in the palm of history, where the boundaries between the self and the sand begin to soften. In the end, the story of these desert skyscrapers is not just a story of architecture or archaeology. It is a story of the earth itself, and of the people who learned to speak its language. It is a reflection on the permanence of the desert and the transience of man, a reminder that while our structures may eventually crumble and our names may be forgotten, the impulse to rise, to build, and to dream will always remain. As the night carries us further into sleep, the image of the towers remains fixed in the mind, a vertical forest of mud and straw, standing silent and proud under the eternal stars, waiting for the first light of a new dawn to once again reveal the impossible beauty of the high places. The shadows have merged into a single velvet darkness, and the Wadi is at rest. The ancient towers, having survived the wars of kings and the shifting of trade routes, continue their long, slow conversation with the wind. They are the guardians of a lost wisdom, the sentinels of a civilization that understood how to live in harmony with the void. And as we drift into the deep, quiet spaces of our own thoughts, we carry with us the image of those jagged silhouettes against the sky, a final peaceful reminder that even in the heart of the desert we can find a way to touch the infinite,